Welcome to episode 20 of the 120 of the Daikaiju Network Podcast. I am your co-host, Kent, and with me is your other
Jason!
co-host. All right, we have a very healthy obsession with Kaiju here, and today we are covering the 16th film in the Godzilla franchise. I'm sorry, it's been a really rough week here, folks. 16th Godzilla film in the franchise. It is 1984's The Return of Godzilla, or simply called Godzilla, or as it's known here in the States, Godzilla 1985, which is more in line with the New World Pictures.
Yep.
Dub and done by the Roger Corman studio. So yeah, let's get a little bit of gosh, I'm forgetting words. Like I said, it's been a really weird week. Let's get a little bit of the nitty-gritty stuff out of the way here.
Or whatever.
Jason and I, we were just talking, but right before we went live, because it's been really hectic here, at least on my end for the last few weeks, because my son just started preschool. We've had to do things with that. There have been other things such as dentist appointments, haircuts, all sorts of different stuff going on over the last few weeks.
It's also been busy for me work-wise the last couple weeks, so I've been kind of burnt out a little.
Yeah, and I'm really burnt out too. It's just been really crazy. And one idea I floated with Jason was at least maybe for the next month or couple months or for an indefinite period of time, maybe do only one podcast a month. We haven't decided yet because we just literally brought it up right before we came on. So what I thought we would do is he and I would talk about it briefly again once we get off the air. After this podcast, see what we think about, and if we still, cannot come to any sort of agreement on something, we can talk it over the next week or so. Then once we make up our decision, if we indeed do decide, we will do one podcast a month for the next month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever. We will let everyone know via social media, mainly through Facebook, and we'll just kind of let everyone know there because it's been really hectic. It's been really busy. I almost forgot that we had a podcast this week. I remember.
I kind of somewhat did too. And then was it earlier this morning? I was gonna watch The Return of Godzilla on my Blu-ray, but then I come to find out the Blu-ray disc that I have had no sound in it at all.
And so tell them how you watched it.
Apparently I sent a text over to Kent about the situation that I had this morning, and so we kind of discussed it over and how we were going to do this. And apparently what we did is we set up a little Skype kind of like this here, and I basically watched it on his TV through Skype.
Yep.
And so yeah, I had at least a good running with it. There were some little hiccups here and there right up until when Godzilla gets up after he was being shot with the cadmiums and stuff with a Super X there, and he was going on the rampage, and then once he destroys Super X, it pretty much froze up, and the sky call dropped. And apparently Kent had issues with his internet.
I had issues with my internet,
and from there it was kind of, we almost didn't have an episode for today, essentially because of that. So
yeah, I mean, the issues we had this morning, once the Skype call dropped and I realized I had no internet, which is the reason why the Skype call dropped. I'm just thinking to myself, God damn it, this is just indicative of like the last several weeks. And I just, to say the least, I was not happy because I was saying a few things you wouldn't hear someone say in church. And I was very upset. And yeah, like Jason said, we were kind of wondering if we were going to have an episode at all today. And we were thinking, wow, postpone it tomorrow. Jason brought up the idea of maybe doing it tomorrow. And I'm like, well, no, because I had ideas of, I got to take care of some of my lawn stuff. And I said, I had planned on doing that tomorrow. And I'm like, well, maybe next Saturday. And we're just kind of like, yeah. I was really enthusiastic about it. And like I said, it's, what happened was very indicative of just how these last few weeks have gone. But so we'll let everyone know. If you don't hear anything from us via social media, then everything is going to be normal. Like we have a podcast every 2 weeks, like we have been doing it for a number of months now.
Yeah, and then we're at least trying to get better at least right after when we end our live transmissions here. We should at least kind of get things scheduled up for the next episode. So that'll also be kind of somewhat of a confirmation that everything will kind of be as normal.
Yeah. So, like I said, if you see something from us, then yeah, that means at least for a month, maybe longer, unless we say otherwise. Yeah, then we're doing that for a bit. But otherwise, if you don't see anything from us by, I would say, what is today, the 8th? If you don't see anything from us by like the 15th, then I would just assume that, yeah, everything's going to be the way that it has been. So let's dive into the movie here. 1984's Godzilla, or as I prefer to call it, The Return of Godzilla. So then that way there isn't confusion as far as like, okay, are we talking about the 54 Gojira? Are we talking about the 2014 or the 98 film?
Or,
excuse me.
Or you just call it Godzilla 1985.
Well, yeah, but then a lot of times, though, like I was just about ready to say, there's that association with people thinking, oh, you're talking about the American one. We are going to cover the American one in this. It's not, I guess in a way you could say, yes, it's going to be two separate reviews, but in a way it's not, because by and large, obviously, the movies are the same, except obviously most of you who, especially those from our generation who grew up watching the movie, there's a lot of just footage cut out of the Japanese film. And then like
it was really heavily edited from what I've seen.
Oh yeah. I mean, it definitely is. And, anyone, especially now with the Kraken, for those people who have bought it and either have a copy of the 85 film or just simply remember what it was like. I mean, you can easily tell where the cuts were. And even in the 85 film, there were some sequences left in, but they were just rearranged. So, yeah, it's just, we'll cover it. We're going to cover that more towards the end of our sort of big review here, which will be the Japanese cut. Because, like I said, it's virtually the same thing. It's longer. It has all the footage that the 85 film doesn't. In the 85 film, yeah, they filmed, I think if I remember correctly, when I did the math here a few years back, the New World Pictures, they ended up cutting, I think it was like, if I remember, I think they cut between like 20, 30 minutes out. I don't remember the exact number. I had all that stuff before, and then they filmed like about another 15 minutes worth of stuff approximately. So yeah, and the run time for the American cut is 91 minutes, whereas the Japanese cut is pushing an hour 45 minutes. So
right,
with that, let's just go ahead and jump into the plot overview of The Return of Godzilla. And so the movie starts off with a volcanic explosion on Daikaiju Island, and it releases Godzilla. And only one person, Hiroshi Okamura, survives Godzilla's attack on the Yatamaru, which was sailing near the island. The Japanese government imposes a news blackout on the incident until a Soviet sub is destroyed by Godzilla. With the Soviets believing the U.S. destroyed the sub, the Japanese lift the blackout to prevent the possibility of war between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Godzilla makes landfall briefly to gather radiation for energy. And then on this particular encounter, Professor Hayashida, played by Yosuke Natsuki, realizes high-frequency sounds can lure Godzilla. And Godzilla eventually makes landfall in Tokyo, proceeds to destroy most of it. Conventional weapons obviously are useless, but the Super X, a flying, heavily armored vehicle equipped with lasers and cadmium missiles, holds its own against Godzilla until it too is destroyed. Hayashida and Hiroshi help set up a high-frequency machine at Mount Mihara in hopes to lure Godzilla into the volcano. And then finally, Godzilla follows the high-frequency sounds and eventually falls into the volcano, seemingly defeated. All right. So that's basically the main plot overview. There are some undertones there and all that, of course, that we'll get into and definitely more detail sequences too. First, what would you like to discuss about this film, Jason?
I think this is the second time I've seen Return of Godzilla. And I think what I can remember from the first time I've seen this cut and then seeing it for the second time, to me, it kind of feels a little bit more different this time around. And then some of the things that I was kind of hoping to at least see and hear, especially with seeing the 85 American version of it, I always kind of had to remind myself, no, this is the original, but the international dubbed version of the film. So I was kind of, so I kind of had to remind myself at least a few times there, and then as far as the dubbing for this one, it seemed some of the actors, even though that some of the main characters in this were a lot younger, but they kind of had more of a older voice dubbed over. And also I totally forgot that they also dubbed the Russians in this version, which to me it seemed a little bit odd. Given that,
I like the fact though that they gave, if you listen, they tried to do a Russian inflection.
Yeah,
which I thought was a nice touch.
Yeah, which to me it felt a little bit odd because I was more used to them in their own language, which the 85 version just kind of left it the way it was, and I pretty much guessed that the original cut did the same thing too. So I was kind of more used to just hearing them in their own language there. But it felt a little bit different this time around, and was kind of had to remind myself that even though that more used to the 85 version, that I had to remind myself that I was watching the original, but with the international dub version.
Yeah, you bring up the international dub there and just kind of how it's different from what you're used to. Two areas I will argue in which the 1985 version is better than the Japanese cut is, and even just the international dub. When I say Japanese cut, I also mean the international dub when I mention that as well. The dubbing for the 85 cut is definitely superior in every way. And also there are certain scenes in the 85 film where there is music where there either isn't or very little of it in the Japanese cut.
Yeah.
And I will argue that in certain sequences, those scenes provide the music is more effective in providing a more haunting and eerie scene, such as, for example, towards the end of the film where Godzilla's walking by the building in which Hayashida, Goromaki, and Naoko are testing out the high frequency sounds. In the Japanese cut, when Godzilla walks by that building and eventually turns around in response to that high frequency sound, there's no music. In the 85 cut, there is. And I will argue in the 85 cut, that makes it very eerie and superior because they use the original Japanese music and bring in some of this music where it works perfectly in the sequence. So with that being said, I would say those are the two areas in which the 85 film sort of is either superior in certain spots, at least, than the Japanese cut. However, also, I want to say something about the international dub. The international dubs have been getting I've been seeing it an awful lot. Uh, I've been seeing it an awful lot in social media. I've even heard quite a bit of it in the last few years or so at G-Fest, where a lot of people bash on the international dubs. And I can understand why people would think that, because a lot of the international dubs, especially if you've watched the Heisei versions of Godzilla, um, the dubs, I will admit myself, are kind of lackluster, because how they recorded it, and then also a lot of times the voice actors sort of lack of inflection and trying to
Yeah,
evoke certain emotions.
That's kind of one of the things that came across my mind is that it seemed the people that were dubbing these characters, is that it seemed like they really weren't much in character in a way, and that they were just kind of looking at the script while speaking, and it just didn't seem like that they were really into it or in character.
Right. With that being said, though, I don't think international dubs are as terrible as people say they are. Yes, I would argue that, like, compared to the old AIP dubs, and compared in this case to what New World Pictures did with this film, yeah, the international dubs are inferior, no doubt about that. But I don't think they're as terrible as people say they are, the international dubs.
Right.
Yeah, they don't seem to lack the oomph in terms of emotional expression in their voice like a lot of the American dubs do. And at the same time, too, it does seem like certain people are not paired appropriately with their characters, because like some younger people, like Jason said earlier, are paired with voice actors that are actually older, or at least sound older. There are young women who are paired with older female voice actors. I've even heard the exact opposite, where there are what's that?
Apparently someone's doing some vacuuming out in the hallway here. So
like some robot was attacking.
Yeah, they're like going up the stairs vacuuming here right now. It's like literally right behind my TV.
Okay. Hopefully it'll all end quickly here. But
I hope so too.
But I've seen the exact opposite in dubbing, where you have shit, I forgot what I was.
I would say some of them can be really good, depending upon the people are casted to do the dubs for the international. But here it seemed like they didn't really have a good enough team to do certain things.
Well, if you pay attention to this particular dub, you will notice a lot of similar voice actors who have been involved in the Heisei films. They're I mean, definitely, if you're pretty familiar with the Heisei films, like I am, you recognize a lot of the same voice actors very distinctly. I mean, I've watched enough of these films, including some of the Gamera films, including other films like the American dubbed version of Warning from Space. That too has a lot of voice actors that I've heard in Godzilla films and Gamera films from the 60s and what have you. So yeah, there's a lot of familiarity. By the way, anybody who's watching this on YouTube, there's a window next to the video where it says Top Chat, and it says say something. If you're watching this live, please go ahead, interact with us, ask us questions, make comments or whatever, as long as it's Kaiju related and all that, preferably at the moment Godzilla 1985 related. Hey, we will read it, and we will have a discussion here. So yeah, there's that, just a reminder.
And I know you were talking about the music, comparing the two versions of the film. And I also would have to say the 85 version, the way that they did the music throughout the entire film, and how they incorporated it, I think in my opinion, I think the American version did at least a much better job as far as doing the music and adding it in the right spots, and as well as incorporating certain styles of music to kind of give it that eerie and horrifying kind of feeling to certain circumstances. Whereas in the original Japanese cut of the film, it felt like a little flat at times, but then they also had in the music and the right areas where the American version kept those scores in those scenes.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of it's just because we're from a generation in which American films anymore have a lot more music throughout most of their films than they did even back in the day. Japan, I've kind of noticed to a certain degree, has sort of caught up a little bit with that they're starting to slowly incorporate that into more of their films now. They're just not as fast in adopting that. I'm not saying that whether they should or not, that's totally up to them. But I also want to say though, too, because I totally agree with this view that, and like I mentioned it earlier, I think adding music or changing the type of music used in certain scenes added more effect. Again, I'm biased in that because I am, a mid 30s guy born in the mid 80s, and grew up on American films, where definitely by this point in American film history, more music was incorporated throughout an entire film. And in fact, one of the reasons why soundtracks became very popular sort of in the 70s, if not early 80s, was to kind of help not only advertise films that were coming out and were out at the time, but also to make some extra money as well towards the film. So it's not like these, movie companies and everything, when they add a soundtrack, they're trying to help out the consumer. No, in a way, it's more about trying to make a little extra money off of that film. So, I'm a product of my time. I'm also a Westerner. I grew up mostly on Western films. I still watch more US type films than I do Japanese films, although I do kind of wonder in the last couple of years if that's changed a little bit. But
yeah, I think for the last few years for me, I've been kind of getting into more seeing the foreign films, because you've seen some of my my lineup of films. I've added more Kurokoba films, or I think that's what his name is, with Yojimbo, Sanjuro, Seven Samurais, a lot of those. Yeah, Kurosawa. But so I've been kind of watching more of his films.
I still haven't watched all Seven Samurai. I started that 2 years ago and never finished it.
But kind of like in those kinds of films too, they didn't use a whole lot of music in those films too, but I think it was a little bit more effective that way. To me, it kind of depends on the kind of film and how they incorporate the music in those kinds of films. It's more effective, just seeing the emotions from the characters, and you're kind of more appealed to them rather than the music themselves.
Right. And I think, and again, like I said, I'm a product of my time, so I have not watched very many films that didn't have as much music throughout. So as a result, that's just something I am used to. And that's not to say that when you don't have music in certain scenes or what have you, that it doesn't work. No, it's just because that is not something I am so used to seeing an awful lot. And the more I watch the Japanese cut of the Godzilla film, the more I have definitely warmed up to it. Sure, it's still tough for me. I still prefer how New World Pictures did it, simply because that's the one I still have seen the most. That's the one I grew up with for many years. It wasn't until 2010 that I saw the Japanese cut for the first time. So, it's just, again, I'm a product of my generation, what have you. And you bring up the composer. The composer is Reijiro Koruku. I find it a little sad, though, that he and director Koji Hashimoto never returned to the Godzilla franchise. I just don't know if they were never asked back, or if they were asked and turned it down. I don't know, because from what I've seen in my research of this film, at least in Japan, it did fairly well. It wasn't, I guess, a major blockbuster in the way that they were hoping it would be, because they spent a lot of film, as some people who may have done research too, they spent a lot of money on this Cybot Godzilla, this really tall robot Godzilla, which was used an awful lot for facial expressions. They even spent a lot of money on building this kind of this foot that they used in a couple scenes in the Japanese cut too. Obviously, they were removed in the American cut because the Americans thought it looked a little cheesy. So, I mean, Toho spent a lot of money on this. It was the first Godzilla movie in 9 years. And so they kind of thought, people would be ready. And apparently, while people went and saw it, I guess it wasn't, it made money. It wasn't the sort of, I guess, reception that they were hoping for. That's not to say the movie did poorly, because director of special effects Teruyoshi Nakano, who did a lot of the Showa Godzilla effects after Eiji Tsuburaya passed, was the director of special effects for this film. And I believe this was his last film that he was a director of special effects on. And he and his crew won a Japanese Academy Award for their work on this, which I think is very, very good. And I've said it before on previous podcasts, and I don't mean to try to get off track here from composer and director, but just as a side note to Nakano, and what he and his crew did here, I truly believe, as far as practical effects Godzilla films go, these are the best effects, and in my opinion, the best model work I have ever seen in a Godzilla film, in which you have the traditional practical effects with man in a rubber suit, model cities, and all that. I think the level of detail and the scale here is unrivaled. About the only thing that comes to mind that could potentially match it on some level is the ending fight to Godzilla versus King Ghidorah, 1991. I think that final battle is really great. However, a lot of the buildings, as you can tell when they crumble and all that, are very hollow. They definitely look like they definitely just look like models. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but at the same time, for some people like myself, it kind of takes you out a little bit briefly. Here, that's not the case. These buildings are solid. When they break apart, they look like the real deal. And so I really think it's unrivaled. But what Kuroko and Hashimoto did here, I think, is absolutely wonderful work. I truly think what they did here, even though, and maybe that's part of the reason why they never came back, was maybe because they weren't asked to, because maybe Tanaka and Toho thought, well, yeah, you did a good job, but you didn't provide us with the blockbuster we had expectations for, and so we're not going to ask you back. But in terms of tone and in terms of being able to make a very honorable remake, in my opinion, so to speak, of the original Gojira, I think this one is marvelous.
I still probably think that Kuriko and Hiroshima were asked.
Kuroko and Hashimoto.
Yeah, Hashimoto were asked to at least come back for maybe one of the films, but they probably they probably thought that they had other better projects to do or something like that. That could be my other guess too. It seemed like that the film did at least pretty well, and at least probably asked them to come back for another sequel, but then probably they says, oh, we got other projects that we've had in mind here and there, so then they sought out another director and composer and the like.
Well, yeah, I remember in my research, all my research on the film has said that, yeah, the film made money, but they were hoping for it to be bigger. than it actually turned out to be. And that's part of the reason why Biollante doesn't come for another 5 years. There were other issues. Like there were issues as far as how to develop the story for that one too, that took a little bit of extra time too than they had hoped. But part of the reason why Biollante took a little bit longer to produce was because they thought, well, you know, maybe people were just not as ready for another Godzilla film. And so let's just kind of let it cool down, come back later with something a little bit different, and then once again see how it goes. And then of course, obviously, even after Biollante sort of underperformed expectations as well, that's when Toho got a little bit more involved, and I think even Tanaka himself got a little bit more involved with the productions. And then you start seeing very familiar kaiju foes. You start seeing familiar tropes in the stories as well. And then all of a sudden, then that's kind of when the Godzilla films, well, and even smaller budgets too, sadly, you can easily tell. You take a look at this film and Biollante, you definitely can see higher production value. But then after they both made money, like I said, but they sort of underperformed expectations. But then when you go look at King Ghidorah, it definitely looks cheaper. Now, I know some people will argue that, you know, King Ghidorah won a Japanese Academy Award for effects. My response to that would be like, that's fine. That's great. That's wonderful. But at the same time, I will argue this. It must not have been a very good year for special effects films in Japan, because I will argue the effects in King Ghidorah still are really, I think, several steps behind from what Nakano did in this film. And I forget the director of special effects for Biollante. I think it was Kawakita. Yeah, Kawakita, I think, did effects for Biollante as well. So, you know, Koichi Kawakita, you know, I do like the man. I do like a lot of his work, but I would argue his effects work in Biollante was far better. And what Nakano did with this film, The Return of Godzilla, is both are superior in every way to King Ghidorah.
And kind of like what you said, you know, when both got The Return of Godzilla and Biollante kind of somewhat underperformed and everything, at least from what we've seen, read, and watched, I think over the years, a lot of the people, not only here, but over in Japan as well, that a lot of people have been surveyed what their favorite monster or favorite movie was. A lot of them have been kind of, at least, I know it's kind of getting somewhat tying into with Biollante, even though we're not talking about Biollante right now. That'll probably be saved for the next episode here. But a lot of people, both here and over in Japan, have been saying that Biollante has been like at least their favorite monster or movie.
Well, and for me too, I remember when I first saw this movie, and for a number of years afterwards, I hated Biollante. I had a friend who I had in grade school that had seen it and was telling me it was one of the greatest Godzilla films he had ever seen. And so when I finally, a couple years later, was able to track down a copy of it, I actually was very disappointed. But I was younger at the time, and I could not really appreciate and understand fully the story and what was actually going on. And then as I got older, it wasn't until, 2012, which was the first time I had seen the movie in a decade, maybe even a little bit more, that all of a sudden that's when I really fell in love with Biollante. And then also, of course, in 2010, when I saw the Japanese cut of this film, that's when I really fell in love with this film, because growing up, I thought Godzilla 1985 was all right, but I was not high up on it like Jason. Jason just fell in love with it. And I actually was sort of annoyed every time he would rent the film from a local video store, because I'm thinking to myself, really, this Drek again? Like, you're really gonna, like, why don't, look, I'm getting Monster Zero. Why don't you go get Mothra versus Godzilla over there? Like, those films are more fun than this. But even now, like, I look back at the New World Pictures version of this film, and yeah, I mean, after seeing the Japanese cut, you will look at the New World Pictures film and you will be like, holy shit, like, the American edit really pulled, again, very similar to what happened in 1956. You had a lot of the original Japanese film edited and cut for not just runtime, but even content as well.
Mhm.
And here comes Raymond Burr. I love Raymond Burr. I'm not blaming him on this, but you have the American production studio making all these changes, and it takes away from the film. That doesn't mean that the 85 film and King of the Monsters are terrible films, but they are very weak. I will even argue that, yes, they are terrible to some degree, but it's not because of Raymond Burr. And here with New World Pictures, they take a lot of the heart and soul out of the Japanese film, because the Japanese film is much more somber. And you do get that if you really, and you don't even have to pay awfully close attention to 85 to really see that the Japanese scenes in the 85 cut, there's really, outside of the hobo, there really is no comedy in this.
Yeah, it's kind of like what you said, that's more somber, but I would also like to say it's a little bit more serious in there, with the exception of the homeless guy in the film there. But when it comes to the 85 version, I think they try to kind of somewhat poke fun at it a little bit and kind of add some comedy to it. I mean, it's fine when appropriate here and there, but
if you want a drinking game, or if you're basically pressed for time, if you're pressed for 15 minutes, then go ahead, pop in 85. But 15 minutes ain't gonna do you, a damn, it just.
And then as well as just more or less just product placement.
Well, yeah, I mean,
when it comes to Dr. Pepper.
Yeah, and so I mean, let's basically, because we're already talking about. This is also kind of, I guess, we're kind of jumping around a little bit differently than I thought we would here, but
yeah,
let's kind of discuss the differences between the films. And I think especially now, if you're a Godzilla fan, you've already purchased this film. And excuse me, if you are like of our generation, you remember 85 or have seen the 85 film, the big differences, and for those of you who have been fans long for a number of years and also have done enough research on your own, will find what I'm about to say very familiar as far as what happened with the 54 film. With this film, some of the political elements were taken out and edited. And I will get to it here in a moment. And I thought I was going to lay this to rest for a good while.
I figured this might come around. And if you weren't, I was probably might bring it up as far as the comparisons of the politics between this film and then the other film that you're probably thinking of.
Shin Godzilla.
Yes.
Yes. I thought I was going to have. I'm sorry. I know I said like 2 podcasts ago I was putting Shin Godzilla to rest for a while. I can't. Let's just get it done with. You all know.
I'll just sit back right now.
Longtime listeners of our podcast know I hate Shin Godzilla, and what I hate even more is the weird hypocrisy behind the fact that so many North American Godzilla fans like it. And the reason why that drives me crazy is because not only are many of their arguments that they use in defense of their own opinions, saying that they like it or they think it's a good film, are the same reasons why they hated the the 98 film, and even disliked maybe the 2014 film. But on top of that, many of these folks seem to forget how better Gojira did it and this film did it. I remember when we did our review of Shin Godzilla about 2 years ago now, when we had 01 Publishing on here, and I think I've even mentioned it in previous podcasts, where when I was sitting in that theater watching Shin Godzilla, the very first other Godzilla movie that popped into my head was this film, The Return of Godzilla, because this Godzilla film, when you watch it, And if you know Shin Godzilla just even decently well enough, you will see a lot of similarities. The bringing up of the titles of the Prime Minister's cabinet, and obviously the politics of all this. This film does it so much better. Now, granted, yes, Shin Godzilla was more about the incompetency of the Japanese government in response to Fukushima, but then also playing along with that, it was also about Japanese nationalism. This sort of far right idea of like, you know, up yours, USA, like let us have our own constitution, let's amend it. We want to be our own thing. We want to have our own army and stuff like that. It was very antagonistic towards the US. And I can understand why that was, but at the same time, it was basically a giant middle finger in subtle ways to the US. And I'm not mad because of that, but I just thought, again, Shin Godzilla is more about politics than it is a Godzilla film. The Return of Godzilla is a Godzilla film with politics of the time put in. And the reason why 84 and even 54 did these things so much better was because not only did it not hit you over the head with a bunch of stupid political BS where they're trying to hammer home a point. Like Shin Godzilla's like, look at how incompetent our government is. Look at how incompetent our government is. We want more independence. We want more independence. It's just like, we get it. We get it. Tell us a story. Give us characters. Give us good Godzilla action. Give us a good Godzilla, for crying out loud. They didn't do that. They failed on so many levels, with the potential exception of the special effects. And when I've gone back to watch Shin Godzilla, I'm even questioning the special effects to some degree now as well. But the Return of Godzilla in 54 told an actual Godzilla story. It had characters for you to follow. And the political message of this particular film in 84 is balanced so well because they tell their message. Here, in the 84 cut, and it was removed from the 1985 cut, you have the Japanese Prime Minister actually having the balls to tell the Soviet Union and the US, look, you guys want to use nuclear weapons on our soil to basically destroy Godzilla. That damage is going to roughly cause about a mile's radius worth of complete and utter destruction, but then we don't know what the fallout's going to be.
And then they were also kind of mentioning is like, it's basically for like either the U.S. or Russia to test some of their new nuclear weapons.
Right. And Japan's saying, we don't have nuclear weapons and we will not make them. And a lot of that has to do with the fact because we basically made their constitution for them and we took away a standing army. Japan doesn't have a standing army. They have a self-defense force, which is different. But basically a self-defense force is meaning, for those who are not familiar, it's not like our army where we can send our troops to another country for whatever reason. No, Japan has to keep their troops within their own country's borders. They cannot go outside of that. Otherwise, they're breaking constitutional rules and international law based on those rules that were set after World War II. So here you get the politics, you get the behind the scenes stuff. Not to mention you have the fleshing out of the characters. The Prime Minister is a wonderful character in this film. Sure, in the Japanese cut, similar to what you get in Shin Godzilla, where in Shin Godzilla, the Japanese obviously are very portrayed as being in the right because, hey, it's Japanese national. Just like here in the United States, when you have a lot of films where, you know, white Americans go and save the day, or white males save a white woman in distress or whatever. It's like America always, you know, solves your problems. Whereas, you know, like We Can Do No Wrong, something similar is happening in these two films, Shin Godzilla in 84, where it's like Japan can do no wrong. Our guy's in the right. However, with the 84 film, you have the Prime Minister, which is an actual character, a fleshed out character. You have the politics in which the Soviet Union and the US come to Japan after the news breaks of that Soviet sub being sank. And then the Japanese government's like, okay, before the US and Russia potentially start shooting missiles at each other, we have to say, no, it wasn't the US that destroyed the Soviet sub. It was Godzilla that did it. Don't be shooting missiles off at each other. And the Japanese come off looking very good in this because the Prime Minister is basically playing sort of peacemaker, mediator here. And it's not like he comes out, you know, Superman type. In a way, he kind of does in the end. But we see him struggling, though, too, with the decision because we see a cutscene of him talking to his cabinet, kind of like, Yeah, we know Godzilla's going to come to us because Godzilla's closer to our mainland. We just know it's going to happen. What would be the damage if Godzilla just came and destroyed and we just kind of waited out? Or how would we compare that with the dropping of one, if not two, nuclear weapons or nuclear bombs that would be half the devastation of Hiroshima? What would that do as well in comparison to what Godzilla does here? And they not only try to just kind of compare what the devastation might be, they go back into their history, the dropping of the two atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they just think about it too, as far as just politics and the fact too that, again, here you have the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, the big guys on the block. They never tested these nuclear weapons that they're proposing to use on Japanese soil. And yet they're like, okay, basically, you're not that interested in destroying Godzilla. You are more interested in testing your nuclear weapons and seeing what the effects of those bombs are going to be. You're just kind of using Godzilla's excuse. You don't give a damn about us. And so the prime minister comes out good in the end. And then also in this film, what I like about it, even though the Soviet Union was, a big baddie, although you can start making anybody who knows history well enough knows that kind of in the mid to late 80s, yes, even though it was the height of the Cold War, you could kind of argue that the Soviet Union was making a turn. What I like about the Japanese cut is it doesn't make the Soviet Union out to be bad guys. It also what makes the US look foolish. And I'm okay with that because that's how the world works. Everything's not black and white. There's a lot of gray in everything. And yes, like I said, Japan does come out of this looking very good. Again, it's a film made in Japan. That's kind of what you have to expect. But at the same time, they don't give the giant middle finger to either the Soviet Union or the US or both. They don't favor either country. And even in the end, they make both countries look good. In the US cut, they make that colonel, that Russian colonel on that boat in Tokyo Harbor, look like he's pushing the nuclear missile to launch at Tokyo to destroy Godzilla, basically reneging on the talks that the prime minister had with the ambassador from the Soviet Union. And then, of course, the Americans have to come with their own missile and save the day from the big bad Soviets. No, that's not the case. What happens is when Godzilla's in the harbor, the ship crashes in because he's there, he's making big waves, and the computer starts going off, and the Soviet colonel is trying to hit the button to prevent the missile from being launched, but he's killed before he can do that. And still, the US, yes, comes and saves Japan by using their own missile to block or intercept that Soviet missile. So both countries still look good in this film. But in the 85 film, it's like, no, the Soviets, they're, backstabbers. Of course, they're going to want to try to do this. These guys are trigger happy. They really want to shoot a nuclear missile at anybody because that's big bad guys. And it's up to us, the red, white, and blue to, save the day. It's like, no, that's not how it is. And I really like that about this film is that yes, Japan looks the best out of all three countries, and both the Soviet Union and the US look a little foolish in a couple of scenes. But in the end, though, too, they still look good. So Japan's not given the giant middle finger. Not to mention, unlike Shin Godzilla, which is very militaristic and aggressive in its tone, this film still harbors a lot of the pacifism and the spirit of what Honda and Tanaka and crew had in the original 54 film and many of the sequels that followed during the Showa era. And what was to come even later in the Heisei era and even a little bit in the Millennium era. So, it's a slap in the face what Shin Godzilla did because it tried to not only be sort of a remake of this film, but also the 54 film. The problem is, though, is that not only does Shin Godzilla spit in the eye of both this film and the 54 film because, its tone is different. It's not pacifistic at all. It is just a terrible film. And I'm not going to go any further than that because you guys know what my thoughts are on that. Shin Godzilla is a terrible film. and it Shin Godzilla should never win a Japanese Academy Award. Bad year for Japanese movies. Screw Shin Godzilla. I'm just this. If Shin Godzilla really wanted to do a good political film and not make it dull, and to balance it out, to make it an intriguing film that not only got its politics across, but also told a good story, and a good story that had a Godzilla with a personality in it, this is the film you wanted to really watch and emulate, not go off and make the crap that you did. I'm sorry. I am done now. I'm done talking about Shin Godzilla, hopefully, unless Bylani or whatever ends up forcing me to, but
I know you're going to say that, but then
I'm hoping
something's going to come around to trigger that.
Hope. I still am in awe at the fact that that movie is complete and utter garbage. It's a pretentious piece of film that, and like I talked about in our episode right after G-Fest, Ed Gajaszewski said the people in Japan really, when they talked about the film, didn't talk about the Godzilla scenes. It was about the political message involved. And I was saying it for the last year and a half to 2 years. I said the reason why that film won a Japanese Academy Award was because of the politics. It won in spite of it having Godzilla, or should I say Gino, in it.
Yeah. So what else should we dive into, or should we just kind of move on to the overall thing? Well,
yeah.
I think we haven't really touched upon the effects.
We haven't touched. I touched upon it a little bit, but also I want to talk about like the story and the human characters as well.
Okay. As far as the story of it, to me, compared to the 85 version, I would say it's a little bit different, with the American stuff in it, but it seems it wasn't too far off between the Return of Godzilla and the 85 version, sans the American cuts in there, and then some of the other cuts here and there, just to kind of make the Soviets look terrible in the way. But I would say overall the story of both of these are a little bit similar to one another. But if I had to pick the stories out of the two versions of this one, I probably would pick the Return of Godzilla, simply because it felt a little bit more realistic, especially when you see some of the politics behind the scenes, and as well as the main characters and how they kind of dealt with some of the issues and the like. It felt like you're part of the entire adventure of the Return of Godzilla, whereas when you saw the 85 one, it felt more kind of like a popcorn sort of movie. And like you weren't quite as part of it, whereas you felt more part of the Return of Godzilla.
Yeah. Comparing the stories, I mean, I've made it no secret over, gosh, what, the 8-ish years that I first saw the Japanese cut of this film, that I've said not only is the Japanese cut superior in every way to the US cut, but I've even argued that the Japanese cut of this film is arguably the best Godzilla movie ever made. I understand that some people's jaws may have dropped there, and I can understand why, but I think, and again, we've talked about this on previous shows, and what we're now doing here with this film being front and center in our discussion.
Somewhat.
This film really does capture sort of the original intent of Godzilla. And the interesting, the thing, and I just realized this now. I can't believe after all these years, I just now thought of it, or should I say, realized it. It's amazing. You had the core group of Tanaka, Honda, Subaraya, and Ifukube involved with that original Gojira, along with many other crew members and even cast, quite frankly, who were involved in that film and then many subsequent films. But here you have, outside of Tanaka and like Nakano, from the latter Showa films, more or less a different crew, completely new faces in most of your very iconic crew roles, like in director, composer, etc. And yet the fact that they honored the memory of the original Gojira and also the original intent of Godzilla, just updating it to include the Cold War at the time, and basically saying, okay, 54 was about the horrors of what we faced in Japan as a country with having 2 nuclear bombs dropped on us, but also the fact that we don't want nuclear proliferation. Fast forward 30 years later with this film, it's about, holy shit, like, this is the US and the Soviet Union are like that close from throwing nuclear missiles at each other. Japan is sort of caught in the middle of it. And like, oh, great. Like, are we going to see bombs, like, hitting each other over our skies, and then all the fallout once again draining on us? But then also, in the big scheme of things, not just what does this mean for Japan, but what does this mean for the world at large? It's updating the message. It's I just had a good comparison to like a couple of films. Just think of it as like a film where it's like, okay, someone comes out, makes a documentary saying, look, we need to pay attention to this. This is what we need to focus on. And then you fast forward it X amount of years later, and they're saying, okay, yeah, some things have changed and all that. We don't have to worry so much about this one area, but still the big picture still needs to be addressed here. And it's even more dire now because look at this, we still need to really pay attention to this. It's basically sort of an update on it. And the fact that you have basically new crew creating a similar movie, just updated for the times, it's marvelous. It's magnificent that they pulled this off and honored the message, but at the same time put their own flair on it as well. They really walked a tightrope, and I think, obviously, as you can tell from our conversation here, that I think they've succeeded wonderfully here.
And kind of what you mentioned about bringing in some of the familiar faces for this film. I really liked how they did with that, but also kind of bringing in the new generation of actors and actresses for the film, because obviously it's going to have to be handed off to fresh new faces at some point in time there. But kind of like throughout, we kind of mentioned a little bit about the entire Heisei film. It's really nice to kind of see some of the familiar faces with these films, but it's also kind of relevant, and also kind of time for fresh new faces to kind of come in and take on the roles from what these older familiar people, actors and actresses, have done for so many years in the Showa series there. And it's really good, just kind of a really good mix, and kind of bringing in the familiar faces, and then as well as the newer generation of actors and actresses intermingle with one another, or interacting with one another in these films.
Yeah. And let's talk about characters. It's kind of amazing how we really haven't touched upon them. I really think that You got some good characters here. I mean, they definitely are not the greatest characters uh, you're ever going to see, but I really think that you still have good characters here. Goro Maki, for example, uh, in the beginning is the one of the biggest douchebags you're ever going to see because he exploits the tragedy of in the U.S. edit, meaning '85. Hiroshi Okamura's name is Ken or Kenny. In the Japanese cut, it's Hiroshi. But he exploits the tragedy that Hiroshi had on the Atamaru, and his sister Naoko, who is basically, because of the news blackout, is just dreading as far as what might have happened to her brother. And he basically tells her that her brother was saved and was the sole survivor of this tragedy. And he doesn't do it because he's a nice guy. He does it because he knows he can sell newspapers. But then and he does it mainly because he first finds out that when he rescued Hiroshi from the Yatamaru, when he was just somehow wandering around his little, what do you call that boat? A dinghy out there.
Yeah, whatever.
He realizes that he can't publish a story about Godzilla because the government doesn't want to create a panic. Well, then he's like, well, I'll find a story some other way. So, he takes advantage of the situation here and is exploitive. And this is something else that was more or less removed from, well, it was removed from
the
the
entire
85
situation,
film.
yeah.
Because, and I've always said too, in the '85 film, even when I was a kid, when I first saw '85, I was like 10 years old, 10 years old, something like that. And I still thought it was really weird when later in the movie, when Naoko is bringing Hayashida and Goro some tea, she gives this weird sort of like look to Goro, kind of like, I don't know who you are, or I'm angry with you type of look. And I never, even when I was a kid, I noticed that. And I'm like, why is she mad at him? We never get an explanation as to why in the US edit. We know why when you watch the real version of the film.
Right.
He was a dick. And he exploited her situation with her brother. And it makes perfect sense. And we even get, in my opinion, one of the most powerful scenes. It's very quick, and on the surface, it seems very simple, but I think it's wonderful in that, when Goro comes in to meet the professor, and then Hiroshi's there, but then he quickly leaves the room, and then Naoko is holding the newspaper in which here I am saying it. Goro's story is published in his newspaper, and she basically tells him, look, I expected better of you. Like, what you did was very shallow. It was callous. And I really love that about her character, because a lot of times, even in the '80s, the female characters were always kind of, damsel in distress in many situations, and including in some of the Godzilla films. Not always. I would argue that many of the older Japanese Godzilla films were somewhat more proactive than what a lot of the US films at the same time were. I like the fact that she basically stood her ground and metaphorically punched him in the balls, because he was being a giant douche. He was being a jerk, but he gets an arc in that the funny thing, though, is he doesn't really apologize for it. He basically just kind of softens up in a roundabout way, kind of just, is kind of like, yeah, I sort of screwed up, and, he befriends her. I think I've always took it that Goro and Naoko ended up having a sort of a romance blossoming between them. But
yeah, it's like, for a very long time, I never even noticed that when watching the Godzilla 1985 film about the kind of the differences or things that were cut out and stuff. And I never even noticed that until you brought it up several years ago when you first mentioned about seeing the original version of the Return of Godzilla, and so that's kind of where it's like, okay, I never even really noticed that for a very long time when renting 85, and so I was kind of curious, and then watched it for like the first time many years ago as part of reviewing it for the first time on our show many years ago, and so yeah, it's like never noticed it, and with a bunch of cuts, or didn't notice the small details and the human emotions for a long time until kind of recently here, and so now it kind of makes much more sense to me when seeing the original cut of the film.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, but at the same time, anybody who's a Godzilla fan and just familiar with kind of the history of US production studios getting licenses to these films and then potentially distributing them to theaters, that there is a history of either editing some scenes, either rearranging scenes or taking a little bit out here and there. But this film and the 54 film, I would say, got the worst end of it. They had large chunks of their story just taken out and just
butchered.
Yeah, I mean, as we've already discussed, and just even with the politics of this film, that alone just being removed and redone in the 85 film, I mean, it's a night and day difference on that front. Getting back to the characters, Hayashida, played by Yosuke Natsuki, is given a story that makes us understand why he's doing what he's doing when Godzilla shows up, and is one of a few people in the film that has a realistic approach to Godzilla by saying that the creature is a living legend. He's unstoppable, and that he understands really, and this is more or less his own plan. He basically even comes right out and says, look, the volcano probably won't kill him, because we thought we had killed him 30 years ago. But even before then, we thought Godzilla was this, mythological creature. And then all of a sudden, holy crap, here's this creature that we thought was just, kind of a fake, or, something like that. Here he is. And then we thought we defeated him, and here he is again. It's like, what makes you think that not only what we're doing now to try to stop him, but anything that we do is going to stop him? And, I'm sure it's happened in other Godzilla films, but nothing is coming to mind right now. I can't think of, off the top of my head in this moment, any Godzilla film in which they bring up a plan and they say, who are you kidding? This isn't going to kill him. This is only going to momentarily stop him.
Maybe, I don't know if I should bring up Megaguirus, or...
I would say they looked at that as a permanent solution. And the problem with the example I'm about to bring up,
like Mechagodzilla 2, or
no, they really believed that was going to kill him. The only thing here's the one thing I'm about to bring up, but there's a problem with it simply because we're never really told much about it in the film. Project T from Space Godzilla, where they're trying to control him, which sounds good, but then I've always wondered, okay, well, let's say you do get a hold of Godzilla and you're able to control his movements. What would you have him do exactly? Like, how would that... I think the only thing I could think of with that, and like I said, it's not explained very well in the film, at least from what I can remember. The only thing I could think of where that would be successful is if, okay, Godzilla is going to come to Japan, but then you control his movements and then you steer him away. But that's not going to kill him. I mean, I like I said, it was not explained very well in the movie, so I don't know exactly the whole purpose behind Project T, other than to just basically control him.
Yeah, the only... Maybe another film that kind of comes to mind is maybe Son of Godzilla, with them doing the weather thing.
I'm I
Uh,
would say yes, but at the same time though too, they didn't even know Godzilla was going to be on the island. That wasn't their intent.
yeah, and then maybe another one would be Final Wars. I can't really think much, or maybe
But
Godzilla's counterattack, otherwise known as Godzilla Raids Again.
yeah, maybe that. I mean, yeah, I would say that maybe is the closest. Maybe same thing with Final Wars too, because with Final Wars, Don Fry's character was talking about after they defeated the aliens, he wanted to take them back to the South Pole and then put him in ice again, which isn't killing him; it's just locking him up. Same
Mm-hmm.
thing with Raids Again. It's you're not killing him; you're just containing him. Yeah, maybe those two movies I would say are the next closest because
Mm-hmm.
you're not killing him or permanently defeating him, so to speak. You're hoping that he stays locked up there for a very long time, but there's
Yeah.
not that guarantee. But yeah, that's I really like that character. That character is one of the few in the entire series. I mean, and like I said, it's his plan. He just comes out and says, "Look, I mean, you're nuts if you think this is going to kill him. I mean, will it contain him? Yeah, how long? I don't know, but it's not going to kill him."
Mm-hmm.
And then Hiroshi Okamura, Naoko's brother, and also known as Kenny in the U.S. edit, is more of the go-getter doing the grunt work. Um, his more powerful moments in the film are when he's staring Goro down for his douchebaggery. And the like. Otherwise, it's kind of interesting. You have this character who is very important in the very beginning of the story. Um, uh, you know, involved in this Yadamaru and is the sole survivor of it, and he basically ends up as really a third-rate character. I mean, you do see him, and he sort of helps in terms of setting things up with the high frequency machine. But by and large, I mean, he's just really he's really just kind of a, I guess kind of a useless character after that, more or less. Just kind of not as important, unfortunately. After his, I would say that's sort of a not so great thing as far as the story is that they just kind of drop his character more or less. We already talked about Naoko. Prime Minister Mitamura brilliantly toes the line of keeping a mild nationalistic approach while also being a pacifist. Again, we kind of talked about
Mm-hmm.
the scenes in which he's talking to both the Soviet Union and the U.S. about the nuclear bombs when Godzilla comes ashore.
To me, he kind of makes it more believable. He kind of makes that
Yeah,
role more believable in the way.
he does, yeah. And I mean, he's got the cojones to basically tell the Soviet Union and the US in one scene, look, if Godzilla was on your soil attacking one of your major cities, would you have the guts to drop a bomb on him in one of your cities?
Mm-hmm.
And again, like I said, yeah, it's a Japanese film. The Japanese are going to come out looking a little bit better here, but again, going back to the whole Shin Godzilla thing, this is what Shin should have been because Shin goes way off the deep end in terms of its nationalism. Here, there is nationalism, but at the same time, the prime minister and his cabinet and the nation as a whole is not bringing the giant middle finger to both the Soviet Union and the U.S. It's just like, look, we're our own nation. We want to, we're doing our own thing, but at the same time, we're not going to abandon you as your ally or as a peaceful nation on this planet, but you know, don't be doing something stupid to
But
us.
also, I think he's trying to at least minimize the damage in a way. Whereas with nuclear weapons, of course, obviously, is going to cause more damage, destruction, and a lot more deaths here and there. Whereas Godzilla doesn't do quite as much damage, even though it does damage in certain areas where he that's kind of in his path or way. So it's just trying to at least trying to figure out ways to kind of get him away and just at least contain him or try to find some other ways.
Yeah, and that's kind of funny because we barely touched upon it. The meat and potatoes of this film, at least for those of us who fell in love with these types of films in the first place, the destruction scenes. Uh, I love the destruction of Tokyo in this. The fight between the Super X and Godzilla, I will argue, is an iconic fight that doesn't come up as
Hmm.
often in fan discussions as it really should. I mean, like I said in my plot overview, the Super X does hold its own for a bit until eventually it malfunctions enough to where Godzilla topples a skyscraper on it, which I think basically, yeah, they're dead. Yeah, the pilots are dead, and the Super X is destroyed
But
permanently.
and I also
But
liked how detailed the buildings are in this film, because you
oh
can
yeah,
definitely know, like what you mentioned earlier, the high quality production that were brought in not only in this film but for Baialane, and with the more kind of higher quality production, the more that they can, the more freedom that the crew can do
hmm
with these sort of things, and that's kind of where you can get the finer, minute details that you probably wouldn't have think of to begin with, especially when it comes to these miniature skyscrapers and or other smaller buildings here and there. It's kind of amazing how they kind of make things look realistic in a ways.
right, yeah, and I mean Kawakita first came out of the Godzilla scene with Baialane, and like I said earlier, his work in Baialane is superior to anything else he would do later in the Heisei series. But even then, his work, I would argue, is still a step below what is done here, because even then, there are certain moments, even in Baialane, where certain buildings topple.
Hello?
Features.
You kind
Here,
of you
that's
kind of cut out there for a second.
here that's not the case. They don't look as much. They look like like paper mache miniatures, so to speak. They look they look sturdy. They look and sort of act, quote unquote, like buildings as they
Mhm.
get knocked over and stuff and of that sort. So. Um, Yeah, I mean, I really like the work here, and again, like I said, I just think the budget for this one is definitely bigger than a lot of the films that came after, but still, you really get a wonderful collection of miniatures here. The Godzilla suit, I think, is it's one I've fallen in love with more as I've gotten older.
Yeah, it has to be one of my favorites.
I still have an issue with the teeth a little bit. They're a little too pointed. They still look a little too much like sharpened pencils for my taste, but I do like the look. It's very menacing. The head, I will argue, does look a little bit bigger at times, or a little too big, but I think those are usually the close-up scenes with the mechanical head.
Yeah.
Um, but this is a look. It's not my favorite, but I would say it's definitely top 10 on my personal list. But yeah, I mean, the destruction scene of Tokyo and all that is definitely wonderful, and um, I really do enjoy it. I think I really do think it's wonderful.
Hmm. And the visual effects in this one, with the birds, in the nuclear power plant scene, and then Godzilla's atomic ray, and some of the other things that I can't really think of right now that were part of the visual CGI effects in this film. I say were really good compared to a lot of the other films that probably uh, during that time. And just from watching the film just through only through Skype here earlier this morning, from what I've seen, I think the visual effects and a lot of stuff still kind of hold up today.
Oh yeah, they
Um,
do big time.
with I think only a couple times where I kind of noticed some of the things when they did the blue screen, if they used it that time or still using the matte screen, you can somewhat kind of tell the difference a little bit, whereas you didn't really couldn't tell much when it was VHS and the like, but you can still kind of tell a little bit. Some areas kind of aged a little bit, but a lot of the CGI in this still, I think, aged pretty well so far.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has. I really, um, to me, and again, special effects are tricky, and I will agree with most folks in saying that practical effects do age a little bit better, but then I will argue, though, too, some of them don't. As much as I love a lot of the earlier Showa kaiju films, I will argue even then, sometimes they don't age well. And
Mm-hmm.
part of it, too, is simply because of just how those miniatures were constructed as well. It may not have necessarily anything to do with whether or not they had the materials to make them look great. Because Gojira, and again, I've been probably in some people's eyes a little controversial on this when I say that Gojira, in some special effects way, still looks good, all these
Mm-hmm.
60 some odd years later, but in some cases it hasn't. I will argue, like the hand puppet scene, I mean, it definitely is very obvious it's a hand puppet. There are several other scenes where some of the effects work hasn't aged all that well. Again, part of it's budgetary reasons, part of it is just the technology and the means, but it's part of it just depends on materials, money you have to put stuff together, etc. But this film, it has aged well in terms of almost all of its practical effects, and I will argue has aged better than even a lot of the newer kaiju films has.
Mm-hmm.
But I will argue even with like some CGI, again, if you put enough good money into some CGI, it'll it'll look pretty darn good for a long period of time. I will argue the 2014 Godzilla film will age pretty darn well. Yeah, there are a few shots where you can tell it's obvious CGI, but even then, I will argue it's better CGI than what I've seen in some other films.
Right.
So, I mean, again, part of it's budget, part of it is people who you have working on it and the materials and all that other stuff. I mean, there are a lot of different reasons why certain things work and why certain things don't, or somewhere in between. But yeah, I mean, I think this will continue to look good for many more years to come. I mean, for crying out loud, the film is as old as I am, and it still looks good nearly 34 years later. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just, it is pretty amazing.
Right.
All
Sure
right.
is.
Do we want to go in our final thoughts and our rating?
I think we can probably go on our final thoughts on this. And for me, obviously, I've mentioned about this so many years on the show here, and as well as written form on Facebook or whatever you follow us here, that I really love this film a lot. Both versions. I mean, some of them have their ups and downs here and there, granted, and it's one. I would say it's basically one of my all-time favorite films. Uh, I just love the story, how it's played out, as well as the characters, how they interact with one another, and how they also kind of bring not only the characters but the story to life as well. And the score in it, where they were placing the certain areas of the film, as far as the Return of Godzilla, are great. Whereas in the '85 version, I really like how they incorporated some of the other scores or soundtracks that make that eerie and kind of that horror effect to certain scenes in there. It's and then of course the practical and visual effects that were incorporated in this, and of course the Godzilla suit. I really enjoy it so much. I really can't say enough. And then I know I've kind of mentioned about some of the gripes compared, for both the original with the dub, international dub, and then as well as the American version. Like I said, they have their both ups and downs uh, for their own respect, and I really don't have any other words to mention. It's just a really fantastic film. Either one is good, but I would, if it was up to me, I probably would prefer the Return of Godzilla over 85, even though I've rented that sucker for a very long time, even though that was the only available one here in the States for countless years up until I think several years ago or whatever. But I've can mention that we grew up watching that movie. But other than that, with some of the ups and downs we've mentioned here, I would still recommend buying the Return of Godzilla. Definitely, both. There's both the DVD and Blu-ray versions of that original Japanese cut with the international dub from Kraken releasing, and then there's of course some other bootleg stuff out there too. So yeah, it's the Return of Godzilla definite buy here for me.
Mm-hmm. All right. The Return of Godzilla is a masterpiece in kaiju filmmaking. The movie is a haunting retelling of Gojira, only modernized during the height of the Cold War. Neither of the three major nations involved in the movie are made out to look like villains, even though Japan does come out looking a bit more morally superior. Nevertheless, the politics being shown here is a terrific balance of giving the audience some of the behind-the-scenes workings, as well as telling an intriguing story that keeps the viewer on the edge of his seat. Our characters are given individual tasks and an arc. Maestro Kuroko's score is delightfully haunting and one of the better scores of the Godzilla franchise. Director Hashimoto does a better job of paying homage to Honda than Anno and Higuchi did with their film. The special effects are wonderfully done, and Teruyushi Nakano and his crew were awarded a Japan Academy Award for their work. The U.S. edit sadly butchers much of the tremendous character work and story that makes the Japanese cut a masterpiece. The only area the U.S. edit does a bit better than the Japanese cut is adding some music in particular scenes where there isn't any. This result adds some haunting and tension-filled moments. Godzilla 1985, the US one, is an important film for many Godzilla fans of my generation, and deservedly so. But when you watch the Japanese cut, such as so many of us did in the mid-2000s with Gojira, we find that Japanese cut to be head and shoulders above in quality. The Return of Godzilla is, in my opinion, one if not the best Godzilla film in the franchise. The effects work holds up, and much of the aspects of the story are relevant even to today's times. It's also a more haunting experience than Gojira. Without a doubt, The Return of Godzilla is definitely worth everyone's time. I'd even go so far as to recommend this movie as being a newbie's introductory Godzilla film. This is a very high recommend, and of course, a buy. So, I don't know how much more we can hammer it. We've discussed this film twice over the 8 years we've had a podcast, and even more so in subsequent moments here and there in previous podcasts. I mean, again, I can think of maybe a couple other films that could rival this as maybe being the best Godzilla film in the franchise, but I keep coming back to this one and kind of what the original fathers of Godzilla intended the first film to be, and they succeeded on that level. But I would even argue that this film not only does what Gojira did, I would even argue on a lot of fronts it did things better. And I know that may sound sacrilege, but you know what? That's one of the great things about us here at Daikaiju Network. We're independent thinkers. We are not windsocks where we blow with the breeze. So we think for ourselves. We develop our own opinions.
Yep, that's for sure right there. So, do you have anything else you want to talk about? Anything? Well, I do. I did see something here recently, and I'm not sure if this is true. And it's kind of come. I saw a story on it, but it also linked to an Amazon sort of deal. So I would probably take this with a grain of salt. I want to give you a link here. That this link goes to an Amazon page where, from what it looks like, there's going to be a prequel graphic novel tying to the upcoming Godzilla King of the Monsters film.
Oh,
here, but I'm not sure if this is going to be like actually true just yet.
Says April 16th of next year.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if it's actually true for right now, but so yeah, that's kind of from what I have seen right now. It doesn't have like a definitive title or a screenshot of the cover. It just right now it just says Godzilla 2 movie tie-in, hardcover, April 16th, 2019, and then it has an author and illustrator names on here. Like the author's name is, according to this, is Arvid Nelson, and then the illustrator of Drew Johnson, and then just kind of has some little descriptions here. Godzilla King of the Monsters graphic novel tie-in, official prequel graphic novel tie-in for upcoming Warner Brothers legendary entertainment film Godzilla King of the Monsters. And then it just kind of has some more details of it. I'm not sure if any of this stuff is true right now, since we don't know exactly the title and like anything official as of yet from both Warner Brothers and Legendary as of right now. So right now, maybe just kind of take it with a grain of salt, but with kind of the past history that we've seen with some of the other movies, it could be certainly true at this point, but as of right now, maybe just a little bit true.
Yeah.
But so, and I know I've mentioned about a board game I was thinking about purchasing. So yesterday I did finally get around to purchasing it, and I think this would probably be something that both you and I would definitely get into, along with Kaiju Incorporated. And this one here that I'm talking about, Kaiju Crush, the board game, and it's made by Fireside Games. The running time of this is 45 minutes, 2 to 4 players, and then ages 10 and plus. And essentially,
should take some pictures and share that on our Facebook page.
Yeah, and essentially, if you look on the back here, the board is actually just tiles here, and I think you get certain tiles with the monsters that you play as, and with the spaces that Kaiju occupies, you get kind of like your own colored kind of stomping area there, and then it's got different cards here. Kind of says you can move, crush buildings, and then as well, of course, fight other monsters. And then let me just kind of read the little description here. Giant monsters have gathered to determine which kaiju is supreme. It's just kind of based on this. It kind of sounds a little bit like King of Tokyo in a way. Crush buildings for points through limited grid movement. Earn in-game bonuses and gain extra points for locations of crushed buildings. Numbers of city tiles claimed and specific patterns formed. When another monster is nearby, fight. Use brains and brawn to claw your way to victory.
It's amazing. I have never heard of it and seen anything about it.
Yeah, I'd never heard about this too until probably about a month ago. Just when I was over at the comic book store, which is just about 100 yards away from my place here. And I was just kind of rummaging around what they had as far as comics, and then just kind of looked in their board game section. And then lo and behold, I saw on one of the lower parts of the shelves, I saw this here, and I was like, oh man, this. And then just by reading the description and everything, and then I've seen some of tutorials and how the game is played. It's like it looks pretty interesting in a way. And then with the things that are included in the game, 4 monster figures and stands, 4 monster tiles, 5 movement cards, 6 objective cards, 13 special ability cards, 38.
It almost sound like 13 special abuse cards.
38 city tiles, 80 territory markers, 20 combat victory tokens, 4 reference cards, and 1 rule book. And
shoot, I was hoping there'd be 2 rule books.
And just kind of take a look inside here. I haven't really unwrapped anything
Sorry
yet.
for those of you listening to the audio podcast.
Yeah, so you can kind of see the insides here. This one, this bag right here is your main kind of tile cards, kind of form the main board there, and then of course the cards here, like the fighting, and then the reference cards and movement cards here, and then of course you got your rule book, and then some of the other promo stuff for other games that are made by this company here. You can kind of see some of the other promotions on the side of the box here for other games, like Here Kitty Kitty.
I want to play that game.
And then Castle Panic, Engines of War, and then Hot Shots.
The weird things that come into my head.
But yeah, that's kind of what you kind of see in the inside of this box. For those of you that are watching this on YouTube or and listening on the audio version, it's just kind of mainly just tiles, cards, and then some other pieces and stands for the kaiju figures and the like.
You should take some pictures, post them. Something I just realized we should have done when you were here like a couple months ago was we should have recorded a video of us playing King of Tokyo.
Well, I know I think I mentioned in the previous episode, or probably in the kind of after the episode, that I've been kind of planning on doing a kind of a new show to kind of expand our presence somewhat. And I was probably going to do not only, figure reviews and some of the like, but also kind of do board game reviews, of course, kaiju related or card game reviews, and just kind of also show kind of the basic kind of tutorial or kind of basic premise on how the game is played.
Mm-hmm.
And the like. And then we can maybe, like, one of these times just kind of do like a videotaping of both of us and upload it on YouTube, and kind of seeing us play against one another on one of these games here.
We could even do it online.
That too, yeah. Do it live. Do it live!
We'll do it live!
So yeah, that's essentially Kaiju Crush there, and the game looks pretty promising the way it looks, and of course made by Fireside Games.
All right,
and it's was it $30 that I can remember. $30 for this game.
Oh no!
So yeah, Kaiju Crush.
All right,
from Fireside Games.
Well, with that, that's episode 120 of the Daikaiju Network Podcast. When we wrap up here in just a few seconds, Jason and I will continue to discuss about this whole deal with the podcast, and we'll kind of let everyone know from there as far as what we plan to do. So thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. And if I remember correctly, I would pull it up. I think we're just doing the rest of the Heisei series, I think.
And then before we sign off, make sure you like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and as well as subscribe to us on minds.com, and then of course subscribe to us on not only iTunes but Google Play, and then make sure you hit that subscribe button down below there so you can follow us as far as new videos, and as well as hit that bell icon as well to get new updates
share our page and our podcast. Damn it.
Yes, that is true.
Yeah, I looked at our tentative schedule here. We are basically doing the entire Heisei, the remainder of the Heisei series, and then after that, it looks like we're going to do Gorath. After that, and then we kind of get into some different odds and ends films, and then we're going to do Godzilla 2000 after a few of those.
Sounds like a plan.
We need to discuss, too, because I know we were talking about just redoing all of the reviews from Gojira on up to Godzilla 2000. Something we need to discuss at some point. Probably won't be till next year, though, is whether or not we want to just even redo the Millennium series as well. But we can discuss that at a later point.
Yeah.
Because right now we got another pressing issue to discuss. So thank you for listening.
Bye, everyone. We'll see you next time. Take care.